which is a good way to start the second session. That's the Romans 1, 16, 17. But before we do that, my two stories for tonight. And then I'll have something at the end. You know, one of the main things that churches do is have something like bake sales. So this is a story about a bake sale. A woman was asked to bake a cake for the church's ladies group's bake sale, but forgot to do it until the last minute. She found an ancient-food cake mix and quickly made it while drying her hair and dressing. When she took the cake from the oven, the center had dropped flat and the cake was horribly disfigured. There was no time to make another cake, so she looked around the house for something to build up the center of the cake. She found a roll of toilet paper, put it in the center of the cake, and covered it with icing. The cake looked beautiful. Before she left the house to drop the cake by the church and head for work, she awoke her teenage daughter and gave her some money and specifically instructed her to be at the bake sale the moment the doors opened at 9 a.m. to buy her cake and bring it home. When the daughter arrived at the bake sale, she discovered that her mother's cake had already been sold and called her mom. Her mother was horrified and spent a sleepless night wondering what people would think of her. The next day, to get her mind off the cake, she attended an elegant luncheon bridal shower at the home of a fellow church member. She didn't like the hostess, whom she considered an upper-crust old snob. She was horrified when her cake was presented for dessert. She was about to confess to the hostess when the mayor's wife exclaimed, "What a beautiful cake!" And the snobbish hostess grinned with pride and said, "Thank you, I baked it myself." A true creature of God smiled, and the creator of the cake smiled, and she thought to herself, "God is good." So be careful when you bake a cake, or you buy a cake and then pile it off with your own. Now the other one tonight is, I really like this one. It's another one. It's longer, but that's why I'm only having two tonight. It says, this would be a story about faith. A deeply religious man lived in a house by the river, but one day the banks burst and the house was flooded. As the water level rose alarmingly, the man climbed on the roof of the house. A boat came by. "Climb aboard," called the captain. "No, I shall stay here," said the man. "God will take care of me." 20 minutes later, with the water still rising, the man climbed on the chimney. Another boat came by. "Jump aboard," said the captain. "No, I shall stay here, and God will take care of me." With the water now at the man's waist, the helicopter suddenly swooped down. "Quick," shouted the pilot, "climb aboard." "No, I shall stay here," insisted the man. "God will take care of me." The water continued to rise, and soon the man was swept from the chimney and drowned. "I've been having you sought out God. I thought you said you would take care of me," he complained. God said, "I sent you two boats in a helicopter. What more do you want?" So you have to be very careful with that. Be prepared to receive it when God gives it. To say you want something extra special. Okay. Now we go into Romans 1, 16 and 17. It's a very short passage. If you want to open your Bible, I'm just going to read it. It's easier than have one of you read it. It says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith, as it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith." Now, this is a very interesting text because it's the theme of the Romans passage. According to the outline, it's called the theme. And it says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel." Now, that's a confession of the great source of the faith, the gospel, which is often subject to some kind of maybe ridicule or disparagement. A lot of times we run into that as Christians. But we should not be ashamed of the gospel. It's a confession of faith to agree to do that. Then Paul said he kind of felt tempted to shame. The early teachings are a stumbling block to Jesus, and to the Jews, and folly to the Greeks. And Paul doesn't succumb to this criticism. He's very confident in the gospel. So keep that in mind as we go along. The gospel forms the letter's body. Paul had already used the gospel 4 times in the text, but here it has the focus. Now let's look at the definitions sheet. You have that.
Larry, I want to ask a question.
Yes.
They keep referring back to the Jews, and at this point, do they still consider themselves Jews, or do they consider themselves Christians?
We're going to talk about that in a little bit. The Jews here are referred to by, they mean the people who continue to hold on to the Hebrew faith when he talks about the Jews. So there'd be Jews in the cities where he went that held on to the faith rather than became Christians. And Gentiles also were everybody who was not a Jew. So at the same time as we deal with these other things, we have to be careful about that, and that we are looking at. Now, I want to get my sheet out here. I have it. Let's look at the definitions sheet because it's very important. The 3 words we want to look at first of all is the word gospel. And let's look at the meaning as it's down on the text. That's the one that has the 6 words on it. The Greek term is evangelium, and it means good tidings of any kind. In Christian literature, it generally means the good news about Jesus Christ, the proclamation of the saving event of which Jesus' life, death, and resurrection were the center. God had acted for our salvation, and it needs to be proclaimed. It is mainly used by Paul 60 times in his letter. It is used 13 times in Mark and Matthew, not used in Luke or John, twice in Acts, and once each in 1 Peter and Revelation. Now the term power of God, which comes in the next verse, it's dynamis is the Greek term. It's used to designate a miracle, a manifestation of God's omnipotence, or a mighty act of God. It is not just about past event, but more giving a very true sense that it is still occurring. The gospel is a proclamation of this power, and it is the very power itself. Then salvation, or soteria. You maybe have heard the theological term soteriology. Well, that's the study of salvation. It means deliverance to safety and rescue from danger. In the New Testament, it mainly means the great deliverance which God will bring to pass in the last days. Thus, it is mainly an eschatological term, eschatological meaning about the end times, referring to the end times. A large part of Romans is concerned with the nature of this salvation. It is rescue from the bondage to sin and death, overcoming fear and hostility, and the attainment of reconciliation. This God has done in Christ and is still doing. It will be attained in the last day, but it has already begun to come. It's not here yet, but it's already begun to come. It is offered by God to all through faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. So that's basically what we're saying here in the text of the theme. Okay? We have those 3 words, and I'm going to get to the place where I have to go here. The next section is talking about the power of God for salvation. Power lies mainly in the cross of Jesus Christ and his crucifixion. Now, one of the texts that is very helpful to do that, and we're going to look at that here, is 1 Corinthians 1:18 to 25, if you want to open your Bibles to 1 Corinthians 1:18 to 31. And this would be Paul's summation of what he means by the cross. It says, "For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the cleverness of the clever I will thwart. Where is the wise man? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. I think that's an extremely good passage text, and it really clarifies what Paul means when he talks about salvation through the cross. And that's where it comes. Now, this point about the Jew and Gentile, and I'm glad you raised that earlier, because in Paul's writing, he claims that he's still a Jew, even though that's his ethnic heritage. But he is of Christ. But when he refers to the Jews in here, he's saying to the people who still abide by the law. That's who he calls the Jews. And the Gentiles, or when he talks about Gentiles, that means the whole world. But when he used the term Greeks, he's referring to those people who were Christians from the time that Paul went among them. And one of the key things of understanding this is, if you remember in the book of Acts, where they had the Council of Jerusalem pretty early in Paul's ministry. And he went to Jerusalem to meet with the council of the leaders of the church. And there they had to make an interesting decision. They made the decision about whether you had to become Jewish before you could become a Christian. And what did they finally decide? Do you remember? No, they decided no. That would be against the whole point. And that's where a lot of this comes from, because Paul was already beginning to understand this issue of salvation by grace through faith rather than through works of law. And he wanted to make sure that people would notice that. So when he goes into a lot of thorough discussion here, and in fact another later text, like I think in the 9th and the 11th chapters, we talk about some of that again, but of course that will be the second half of what we do. But then the term of righteousness of God is revealed through the faith, for faith, it says. It's the hinge on which Paul's theology turns. He does not demand for us to be perfect and holy. We can't do such things. So it results in despair if we try to do it. The righteousness of God bestows by God upon persons and who is revealed by faith. God makes us righteous through Christ. And that's really the key to this text of Romans 1, 16, and 17. Now the other things on there, we're not going to go into them in depth, but there's a couple of things that need to be clarified here. Righteousness is very important. Righteousness designates the intrinsic character of God on an ongoing activity of God. It's not a term of humans, it's God's righteousness that's the focus point here. And God's righteousness has an unequivocal opposition to all unrighteousness. And that results in his wrath or his judgment against sin. And in the death of Christ, both what is required and what was suffered has brought about the righteousness of God. The term righteousness designates not so much God's own righteousness as an act of God on behalf of man. The word is often used in this sense in the Old Testament. Righteousness is obviously a synonym for salvation and means God's act of vindicating those he approves. The Lord hath made known his salvation, his righteousness hath he revealed in the sight of the nations. That's Psalm 98, a quote from 98:2. The term revealed corresponds exactly with the same term here in Romans 1:17. In the psalm, it is clear reference to being made not of passive or stoic, I'm reading the wrong word, passive or static appearance. The action of God is saving, and it is on behalf of those people who he makes righteous. We do not become righteous by doing good deeds. He makes us righteous by instilling in us his righteousness. And then the term comes into justification. Justification and salvation all fit together. Generally speaking, in the Old Testament, those who are already righteous, God is justified. They are made right. They're declared righteous and being created as righteousness of those who are in fact righteous. Paul's doctrine of justification diverges from the Old Testament concept. It involves the declared righteousness and the treating as righteousness of those who are in fact not righteous. Keep that in mind. It's referring to those who are not righteous being made righteous. And that's a key distinction here. Okay, let me get a little. We're then going to go to Romans 1:18. Anybody have a question about this first? This is basically why we did the sheets on definition. Okay. Now, Romans 1:18 says this: "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of those who by their wickedness suppress the truth." Now we're going into a section here of the text. You can see we're 18, from the 1:18 is the introduction, and then 19 through 32 is the failure of the Gentiles. So we're going to first take to task the Gentiles, and then comes the failure of the Jews, which he takes them on too, and then talks about the impotence of the law, which is the last section here. So, in verse 18, Paul diagnoses the human condition. Man is created in the image of God, but God's law is written upon his heart, but it has fallen under the control of sin. Sin is an outside demonic power, not just in act or attitude of rebellion versus God or transgression of the law, which has gained its entrance into man's life and reduced him to bondage and transgression. Lying far deeper into the man's life than an act or even the impulse that prompted the act. It is something ingrained within us. And this is a good Lutheran theology understanding of sin. Sin is not the act, what we call sinning, or the sins, the individual little bad deeds we do. Sinning is our relationship of estrangement with God, that which cuts us off from God and goes within ourselves. And people who then are separated from God are more likely to participate in those things that are listed here among wickedness. Now, it is true of all just not individuals. Adam becomes the symbol of both sides, the image and the sin. When Adam sinned, all became guilty. It's dividing us within and against each other's too. The estrangement from God creates division within us personally, because we then get caught up in kind of tension within our lives. We don't know exactly what direction's going on. And then we also then turn to others, and that's why we have so much what we call enmity and sin within the world. Now, the argument of Romans begins here in that all men are guilty before God and subject to the bondage of sin, that they are incapable of saving themselves. Now, this section, leading up to 3:20, there are three main points: the failure of the Gentiles, the failure of the Jews, and impotence of the law. We've already seen that, and that's what we're going to. Now, in 18, sin is bondage and transgression. The death which follows is not just the result of the bondage, it is also God's judgment upon the transgression. So we have to put this all into perspective, and we're going to have quite a bit of text here now that's going to deal with that whole issue. I want to put this over here so this might be more efficient. Okay? Now, in 19 to 23, anybody want to read? Romans 1:19 through 23.
Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's visible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. 21?
Yeah, go ahead, through 23.
For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images, and made to look like mortal man, birds, animals, and reptiles.
Okay. This is the first indictment of the Gentiles. And basically what it is, and it's our human kind. You know, it talks about, in the NRSV, they have a heading of this text that says, the guilt of humankind. And really the judgment upon us is that we participate in idolatry. We put the creature above the creation. And that's where the source of almost all of our sinfulness, our wickedness, comes from. Is we devote ourselves to that which is the human nature of us. So the Gentiles have been given knowledge of God, so they can't plead ignorance. They know what it means to be known. It means not merely that we can be known, but what is known. We're given through the created order of the natural world. They have turned to futile speculations till their ignorant minds grow dark. At every turn in the Greco-Roman world, we meet frank idolatry as its moral accompaniment, I can't say the word. Accompaniments. Godless, foolishness, blinded, lacking vision, fearful. They worship a stone, is a term that's used. If you want to know more about background of idolatry, there's something that we can look at in the Bible. But really, idolatry is the breaking of the first commandment. You know, the first commandment says, "You shall have no other gods before me." I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. If you put any other gods in front of God, you are into trouble. Then, so that's kind of a short piece there. We go next to 24 through 32, and it's going to be a long text, so we want to read it slowly. Who else would like to read 24? Because actually, see, there's a lot of detail in here, but we don't want to spend a lot of time on things. I'm spending most of the time on the basics rather than going into a lot of extreme details. So, go ahead, sir.
Therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the degrading of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men, and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind and to things that should not be done. They were filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, craftiness. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, rebellious toward parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. They know God's decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, yet they not only do them, but even applaud others who practice them.
the good news of gospel galore. The big long list of all these awful things that are done. One of the things I want to clarify on this, and this is, of course, this is one of the texts that those who are opposed to marriage between LGBT people and so forth, that they use this text. But it's just like the text in Leviticus. Yes, it's an abomination to the Lord, but there's hundreds of other things that are abominations to the Lord. So if we're going to treat that one thing as worse than everything else, we have forgotten to see that all of our people fall into these other things. And it's a wonderful, wonderful list. If you want to know what immorality is, you just go down the list. And there's actually, I've made an interesting list because I combined the RSV and the others and come up with other things. It says antisocial behavior, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, full of envy, deceit, malignity, whatever that is. That would be craftiness. Haters of God. They were without understanding. They were foolish. They were covenant breakers. They were faithless. And they, after the other behaviors, they were ruthless and unmerciful. And this comment about, yet they do them by even applauding others who practice them, that is where the big weakness in our society comes.
Yes,
We haven't said
for our society, I think, go up further, up into verse 28.
Yes.
And since they did not see fit to acknowledge
Right.
God.
Right.
Our country right now is that we do not want to acknowledge God.
Well, we do acknowledge God, but not everybody acknowledges God in the same way. And we have to be very careful that we don't get caught up into what I call the evangelical error. That they say, unless you believe like God like they do, you're wrong and you're evil and you're going to be lost.
I'm not getting into that.
No, I don't want to get into it either, but I'm saying you have to be very careful about how we put a focus on one thing. But this, the acknowledgement of God, there are LGBT people who are very faithful people. There are people who are in strange occupations which are, they believe. Now, they have to be very careful of how they do it, but because what I've discovered over the centuries, or, well, not centuries, for decades I've lived, that we have a tendency to forget about the fact that all these things that we do are all together, and our sinfulness is separating us from one another, and that we have to be very careful that we don't treat one individual thing far worse than we do everything else. Because what Paul's actually saying when you read the whole list is, these are the types of things that everybody does. Now, not everybody gossips, but there's a lot of people that gossip. And there's nice little stories about gossip, too, but I'm not going to use that. There's a little bit of envy in all of us. We're a little bit envious. Now, very few of us murder, but we are boastful, and we're rebellious, faithless, heartless. I don't think too many of us are ruthless.
Yeah, I won't be so sure.
Well, in our family, ruthless means we've lost Susan's mother. No, that's a terrible pun. That's a terrible pun. Okay, now in verse 32, it talks about that the act of God, God's decree, okay? It's no more than an abstinence from interference with their free choice and its consequences. That's where I was heading with that other point. I found out over the years that the consequences come from the act itself. You don't always get caught in it. In a sense, even though I am very open-minded to gay people, is I do honestly feel that the fact of HIV coming at the highest point through that community was kind of a sense of doing this. God let them go through this, and they entered into the consequences. But it doesn't really mean that they are any worse or any better off than anyone else, because if you know the consequences, if you get, if you're a teenager and you're pregnant out of wedlock, you have to pay the consequences, either by having the child or adopting it or whatever you're going to do, but you still have to go through with it because what you did created this being. And that's the same thing here too. If you have gossip that creates something, you're as much guilty of it as anything else. I like to watch reruns on TV, and they have been there. The old song the ladies sing about not being gossip, but they don't repeat gossip. You better listen close the first time. They don't repeat gossip. You have to listen close the first time. So the consequences come because God wills establish righteousness and vindicates it where there is transgression and when it's transgressed. So we all have to come to God in this positive way. We have to turn these things over to God and say, we are in need of your love and care. Okay, there's a general breakdown of principles in the pagan world. These are done with tacit approval of the whole society. Yet they not only do them, but even applaud others who practice them. The beginning of the wrath of God is in his withdrawal from society. That's an interesting point to be made. God doesn't withdraw from us, but he makes it possible for us to receive these things negatively, that we get punished. And he's not going to have to do the punishing. In other words, quite often we punish ourselves by the results of the very acts that we're doing here. And the same thing goes with LGBT people. I don't accept everything they do, and they're sinners too, the same as the rest of us. And they need to ask God's forgiveness, the same as those people who maybe don't think they need to ask God for forgiveness should be asking God's forgiveness. I'm much more concerned about the person that thinks they've finally been born again and they don't have to worry about the future. That to me is very dangerous, because we Lutherans, we were born again when we were baptized, and we have to have that renewed all the time. The renewal of God's gift of baptism comes each time we take communion, each time we say a prayer, each time we do this. That's when we are done. So I think that's this section. Now, is there anything else you want to say about these things? What I really want to point out is we have a nice long list here, and we need to make sure that we don't. One of the first things I learned about Lutheranism is there are not degrees of sin. You either sin, and we all do, or you don't sin, which we're not able to do. Okay? So therefore, we are in need of God's grace. It's simple as that. But it's hard for people to accept that. They say, oh, I can't get rid of my gossiping. I'll never make it into heaven. Well, it may be true, because you will be spending all your time talking negatively about God. But at the same time, it's impossible to say none of these things can be forgiven. All of these things can be providing God's forgiveness.
So a gossip has sinned as deeply as a murderer has.
Well, in the sense of being sinful, yes. Yeah. And in need of it. Now, it's very much more difficult for a murderer to get sin forgiven, because they have to really be conscious of their act and be remorseful of it and seek it. Now, that doesn't mean they still don't have to pay the consequences. Say if they've been committed for that, but they can be forgiven. But it's a lot more difficult for them. Of course, some gossips it probably is hard to get forgiven, because they don't. Sometimes they don't understand that they are gossiping. That's the same thing with these other things. Some people, it talks about unnatural intercourse. Well, what is unnatural intercourse? It doesn't explain what is that. You have to use certain positions, or you get in whatever. But again, we're not, that's not the point Paul's making. He's saying these are the things that were happening in the human community that needed to be dealt with by his carrying out the mission to go in and to bring the gospel to it. This is why he's saying this. Not that he wants to be critical of the people. He wants to tell them that if they stay within the society's way of thinking, they're bound and determined to get misdirected, unless they become part of the kingdom of God. And that's where your point, I think, was made very well. Is, one of the things we don't do is we don't put our reliance on God as a society. We don't do it as a society.
What I was just kind of more getting at it is that if we don't acknowledge God itself, then the environment is set, which goes ahead and it snowballs from there. And this is where a lot of, shall we say, the temptations, the sinfulness can go and generate.
Yeah, well, he went down through that long list because
Exactly.
He wanted to make sure everybody that had fun could find something that they did wrong.
Now, is it a lot? Notice on that one there. I'm a history buff itself, but
Yes.
it seems like everything that the long list of, shall we say, was prevalent in the society of Rome at that time, at a large degree. So maybe this is kind of like where this is a letter to the Romans, and this is where the pagan culture of what they have, this is all status quo.
Well, but now while he's talking about this being pagan or non-religious, there are Jews that have the same problems. See, so he's not really making that much of a distinction. When he uses the term, we don't make a distinction between Jew or Greek, male or female, whatever. He's referring to the fact that all fall short and all need to have forgiveness. Okay, now we're going to go deeper into this by looking at Romans 2. I'm going to read this for us and read it very slowly because we're going all the way through verse 24. And I don't want to have to be spending a lot of time going back over things. I just want to point out a few things after we're done reading. Okay? Righteousness of God. Therefore, you have no excuse, whoever you are, when you judge others. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, are doing the very same thing. See, he's pointing out. And that's what happens in our society, too. We're bound and determined to judge certain people. Like we'll judge the gossip, while at the same time as we're envying something about there. So that, we have to be very careful with that. You say, we know that God's judgment on those who do such things is in accordance with truth. You imagine, whoever you are, that when you judge those who do such things and yet do them yourself, you will not escape the judgment of God. Or do you despise the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience? Do you not realize that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? But by your hard and impenitent heart, you are stirring up wrath for yourselves on the day of wrath, when God's righteous judgment will be revealed. For he will repay according to one's deeds. To those who are by patiently doing good seek for glory and honor and immortality, he will give eternal life. While for those who are self-seeking and who obey not the truth but wickedness, there will be wrath and fury. There will be anguish and distress for everyone who does evil, the Jew first and also the Greek. But glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek. For God shows no partiality. All who have sinned apart from the law will also perish apart from the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous in God's sight, but the doers of the law who will be justified. When Gentiles who do not possess the law do instinctively what the law requires, these, though not having the law as a law to themselves, they show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, to which their own conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts will accuse or perhaps excuse them on the day when, according to my gospel, God, through Jesus Christ, will judge the secret thoughts of all. Then the Jews and the law, in verse 17. But let's look at 2 through verse 16 first. Okay, in 1 to 24, the commentary, the Jews now are included in the indictment. There's a term, according to the truth, rightly true. God's judgment is not according to race or nationality, but on the moral facts. Because the Jew has the law is no guarantee they'll escape the judgment. It depends on if the Jew keeps the law, which he has not done. Hearts hard and impenitent leads to tougher judgment. Judgment, like salvation, is essential future, but each has already begun to take effect. So remember to keep that in mind. This is another thing that's good Lutheran. We say we are saved, but we aren't. We are at the same time. We're saved and unsaved because we always have to have salvation renewed day after day, time after time, as we fail. So it's almost as if it's a steady process that we have to be always asking for forgiveness because we always do more things. But again, it's not our asking for forgiveness that gives us it. It's God's gift of forgiveness that gives it to us. Okay, building of question upon question. You've seen this a couple times. We did that in the earlier reading. You know, that's a technique that's used. It's called the Stoic diatribe. It's a style of the Stoics use, and it is very effective. Paul often resorts to it. You see in verses 3 and 4, it says, do you imagine, whoever you are, that when you judge those who do such things and yet do them yourself, you will escape the judgment of God? Or do you despise the riches of his goodness and forbearance and patience? Do you not realize that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? See, he uses 3 questions in a row, almost asking like this, the later ones being rhetorical responses to the earlier questions. Now, and he does that time after time. That's one of the interesting things about learning about these texts is you see once you learn these different aspects of it, you can see them every time you read something new. Then we have 6 through 9 says, it's a very difficult passage because it seems at first to be out of harmony with Paul's main theology, isn't it? It's putting a lot of emphasis on good works. It says, according to his works, who you do good, according to faith. This is the situation apart from Christ, which was our situation before the new way was available, and to those who reject the new way. That's what he's talking about here. The other trouble is that some are actually justified by works. Some suggestions seem to be that there are doers of the law who will be justified as doers. He is speaking largely hypothetically. How the law system is meant to work is how it works. And it really does not do it. Then in 10 and 11 it says, God shows no partiality. The Jews are not excused because they have the law. Gentiles are not excused because they lack the law. God requires hearing and doing by both Jew and Greek. Then 14 and 15 says, Paul, as a Jew, knows that in the Torah, God has made a higher, more complete revelation of his nature and will than he has made in the natural world. Paul is not ready to conclude that the Jew has no advantage, because the Jew does have an advantage. But while the possession of Torah opens to the Jews the possibility of becoming a guide or teacher to the rest of the world, only obedience to the Torah can make that possibility a reality, and the Jew has notoriously failed that. All we have to do is look into history to see that the Jew has failed in their responsibility to carry the faith of Abraham to all the world. And that's where it comes down here to this. It says, on that day, according to the gospel through Jesus Christ, will judge the secret thoughts. That's a key point there in verse 16. The secret thoughts of all he will judge. So he's not going to just judge the outward behavior, but also that which is our basic core. Then we're going to look at 17 through 24. The Jews and the law. But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast of your relation to God and know his will and determine what is best because you are instructed in the law, and if you are sure that you are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, a corrector of the foolish, teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, then teach others, will you not teach yourselves also? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? You that forbid adultery, do you commit adultery? You that abhor idols, do you rob temples? You that boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. I always get a kick out of when I read about here, about you that forbid adultery, do you commit adultery? People often who have violated that themselves are most likely people to commit, to blame others. You see it among some political leaders who have themselves been adulterous, and then they claim that their opponent is an adulterer, while they've been as much into it as anybody else. The name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. That's one of the things that what's happened because they dishonor God by breaking the law. It is impossible to teach others if one has not oneself learned. It is hypocritical and futile to do it. The fact that Jews boasted in the law makes their own disregard of it more flagrant and honest. Okay, with that in mind, are there any questions about this so far? Because we are now going to try to complete Romans 2. We probably won't get into Romans 3 quite yet tonight, because we only have, well, we maybe could start, but unless there's something here you want to discuss about it. Do you understand what he's talking about is Jews can be saved by the law if they abide by the law completely. But if they don't, they're going to be the same as us. They're going to have to put themselves in the hands of God, allow themselves to be received into God's grace.
It seems like here, though, is that also he's saying is that since the Jews already have knowledge of the law,
Right.
then therefore they were held to a higher standards as compared to the Gentiles.
Well, Paul has
Right.
increased them that way, yeah.
Is that they have higher standards than the Gentiles who have not heard.
That's more Paul's thinking than it is God's. God treats us all equally.
Which is also, it says, goes into in that where, I forgot where it says is that those that do good without knowing the law, then it seems like those are held.
Oh yeah, actually you can see there are people who are not Christians that do a lot better good works than a lot of Christians do.
Gandhi would be a great example.
And a lot of Muslims are very positively behaviorally superior to the Jews and Christians because they practice their faith more religiously, even though there are certain factions within there that are way out of base. But a basic, good, solid, fundamental, not fundamental Muslim, a Muslim who understands the reality of life and living, they do usually practice very well in behaviors. Now, if we have that behind us, let's spend the last couple of minutes here in Romans 2:25 to 29, because this kind of completes the this section about the Jews. It says, verse 25 goes on, it says, circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law. But if you break the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. So if those who are uncircumcised keep the requirements of the law, but not their uncircumcised, be regarded as circumcision. But then those who are physically uncircumcised, but kept the law, will condemn you that have written code and circumcision, but break the law. For a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is true circumcision something external and physical. Rather, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and real circumcision is a matter of the heart. It is spiritual and not literal. Such a person receives praise not from others but from God. And that's a very important point here, because when part of the discussion in the Council of Jerusalem, referred to earlier, was they were fighting about whether you had to become a Jew first, which also would have meant you would have to be circumcised if you were a Gentile. But they long, Paul's way into things. This is years later, but he's really focusing here, and he really is putting perspective into the proper perspective. Now, the Jewish reliance on the Jewish nation for which circumcision was assigned, Paul affirms that this only confers special benefits if the law is obeyed entirely. In its entirety. Paul would allow, if one succeeded in keeping the law perfectly, one would enjoy the favor of God, a purely hypothetical condition. If, in the same way, uncircumcised Gentiles kept the law perfectly, they would also be favored by God as the Jews. No Gentile actually can do this. In fact, some Gentiles, in actual fact, came nearer to the keeping of the law than some Jews. It is believed Paul is stressing the inner character of the law's demand, not just behavior, but the heart. And inner righteousness is demanded, and it is hard to fulfill external provisions of the law, which are easier to obey. So we're looking at the whole thing. I think we've clearly brought this to the point where we're ready to go into chapter 3. Next week we won't start it today because there's only 2 minutes, and I have a nice little thing to add. Please it off today. Does somebody have any questions before we transpire ourselves?
I have a question concerning the term being saved. I had a Sunday school teacher, and I was very young in 8th grade. And I was very upset because I had little friends who were saved.
Saved, yeah, right.
And I wanted to be saved. And I went to the Sunday school teacher, and I asked her for grade. And it was so comforting to me because she said, well, yes, of course, at that time I was wearing this grace. She said, yes, Grace,